The first time the Germans heard it, they didn't even understand what it was. A thin whistle, high, sharp, unnatural, cut through the cold morning air near St. Lo in the summer of 1944. At first, some soldiers thought it was a stray aircraft engine. Others assumed it was the wind slipping through the treetops. Then the ground erupted. A column of dirt and smoke rose like a fist smashing into the earth. The explosion hit with a force that punched the breath out of every man in the trench. Seconds later, another whistle came. Then another. Then 5 more, falling one after another with terrifying precision. This was their first experience with U.S. artillery. Unteroffizier Karl Bremer remembered shouting, "Deckung! Into the holes!" But there was nowhere truly safe. The shells didn't land in scattered, unpredictable patterns like the Soviet or Italian barrages they had survived before. These were mathematically placed, planned, almost intelligent. It felt like the Americans knew exactly where every German was standing. For years, German soldiers had believed their own artillery was the finest in the world. Precise, deadly, disciplined. But on the Western Front, in the hedgerows of Normandy, they discovered something even more fearsome. An enemy whose fire didn't stop, didn't drift, didn't miss. It fell like a steel rain, and once it started, it felt endless. Bremer risked a look over the edge of the ditch. The hedgerow that had stood in front of them for weeks was gone, flattened, pulverized. Trees that had survived centuries of storms now lay twisted like hot wire. A Panzer IV, hidden carefully behind foliage the night before, was flipped on its side, tracks ripped off as if by a giant hand. And the Americans weren't even visible. That was the worst part. There were no shouting infantry, no tank engines, no movement. Just distant booms and the rising howl of incoming shells. The attack came from miles away. An invisible enemy. An enemy with perfect coordinates. One soldier, barely 19, pressed his hands to his ears and muttered, "Wir können uns nicht bewegen." We can't even move. Every time they tried to shift positions, a fresh barrage hammered the ground near them, as if someone was watching. Later that night, Bremer and the survivors were pulled back behind the lines. A medic asked him what had happened. Bremer gave a tired smile and said only 3 words. Amerikanische Präzision-Artillerie. American precision artillery. Word spread quickly through the companies. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front swore they had never seen anything like it. The Americans didn't just fire more. They fired smarter, faster, together. To the Germans, that first encounter showed them a truth they didn't want to admit. The Americans had mastered the art of killing from a distance. And the whistle that preceded each explosion would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. By late 1944, German soldiers had learned to fear many things on the Western Front. Thunderbolts screaming overhead, Sherman tanks rolling through the hedgerows, and the endless waves of fresh American infantry. But nothing rattled their nerves like the sound of American artillery warming up. It always began the same way, a distant thump, then another, a rhythm slow at first, like a giant waking from sleep. German observers would look at each other and mutter, "Artillery, beginnt." But what followed wasn't a normal bombardment. It wasn't random or scattered or hesitant. It was organized destruction. This was the American barrage machine in action. American artillery wasn't famous because of a single superweapon. It wasn't the biggest or the heaviest in the war. What terrified the Germans was how much the Americans could fire, how fast they could fire it, and how perfectly coordinated it all was. On the German side, a battery might fire a dozen shells in a short mission before relocating. Ammunition was limited, fuel was vanishing, and every round had to be carefully saved. The Americans, they fired as if they had endless mountains of ammunition, because they practically did. German Lieutenant Otto Schultz remembered one morning near Aachen. His men had dug into a muddy orchard, preparing for yet another attempt to slow the American advance. Suddenly, without warning, The entire horizon lit up as if someone had drawn a fiery line across the earth. Within seconds, shells rained down in a perfect sweep, left to right, front to back, a deadly grid pattern. Not one shell wasted. Schultz later said, "It felt like fighting a factory." The Americans combined something the Germans couldn't match anymore. Industrial power plus mathematical fire control plus insane resupply speed. Behind every U.S. artillery battery stood trucks. Row after row of trucks. Endless columns carrying shells stacked like bricks. Ammunition dumps that looked like small cities. Jeep messengers racing between units. Field phones ringing non-stop. Fire direction centers calculating angles with frightening speed. To the Germans, it looked almost supernatural. Whenever German troops tried to reposition, American radar or observers caught the movement. Minutes later, sometimes seconds, a new barrage crashed down with terrifying accuracy. Even experienced veterans found themselves freezing in place, terrified that one wrong step would draw another rain of steel. Nerves shattered long before bodies did. One sergeant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division admitted after the war, "We stopped fearing the shells themselves. We feared the idea that they never stopped." And that was the secret. The Americans didn't just bombard positions. They broke morale, crushed movement, paralyzed entire companies. Their artillery didn't simply fight the German army. It exhausted it. By the winter of 1944, many German units surrendered long before the infantry or tanks reached them. Not because they lacked courage, but because their nerves simply couldn't endure wave after wave of precise, unstoppable fire. The barrage machine didn't just win battles, cracked the will to fight. To German infantry on the Western Front, there was a specific moment in battle that turned their blood cold. It wasn't when American tanks appeared. It wasn't when enemy aircraft roared overhead. It was when the sky fell silent. Veterans knew exactly what that silence meant. Somewhere beyond the ridge, U.S. artillery crews were setting up their next tactic. One so precise, so overwhelming, and so psychologically crushing that German soldiers began calling it Stahlragen. Steel rain. And once it began, there was no shelter deep enough to escape it. American artillery tactics weren't improvised or rushed. They were engineered, designed, practiced to perfection long before the shells ever left their guns. What made them terrifying wasn't just the firepower, it was the method behind it. One of the most feared tactics was the time-on-target strike, or TOT. German troops first experienced it during the fighting in Normandy. Dozens of American artillery batteries would fire at different distances, from different angles, using different powder charges. But all calculations aimed toward a single goal. Every shell landing on the target area within a 3-second window. For German soldiers, it felt as if the world exploded all at once. Oberstleutnant Hans Keller recalled being caught in a TOT outside St. Lo. His unit heard nothing. No distant rumble, no warning whistles, until an entire artillery mission slammed into the treetops simultaneously. Trees shattered like matchsticks. Earth turned into a storm of dirt and metal. Keller said, "It was as if the air itself had torn open." But this wasn't the only tactic that broke German morale. The Americans perfected rolling barrages, curtains of fire that advanced across the battlefield in carefully measured steps. The shells fell in front of U.S. troops, then crept forward in sync with the infantry, pushing German units backward, denying them any chance to regroup or counterattack. To the men beneath it, the rolling barrage felt alive, hunting them, matching their movements, forcing them to retreat or die. And when the Germans tried to reposition, the Americans deployed one more terrifying tactic: quick-shift fire missions. Their fire direction centers, equipped with advanced radios, maps, and calculating instruments, could redirect entire battalions of artillery within minutes. A German machine gun nest that had fired only a few bursts could find itself instantly pinned under explosive steel. The Wehrmacht simply had no answer. German artillery commanders often needed 15 to 20 minutes to prepare a coordinated strike. The Americans could do the same in 3. They could mass fire from dozens of batteries without moving a single gun. Their communication network worked like a nervous system, fast, responsive, and deadly accurate. Even elite German units felt helpless. During the Battle of the Bulge, survivors of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division reported that American artillery fire followed them like a shadow. Every time they dug fresh positions, new shells bracketed their trenches within minutes. Every time they gathered for an assault, they were scattered by pre-sighted American guns. One soldier said, "We fought the shells more than the men," and that was the silent truth of the Western Front. U.S. artillery didn't simply support the infantry. It shaped the battlefield, controlled movement. It broke German will. Steel rain wasn't a weapon. It was a tactic, cold, calculated, and unstoppable. And it terrified the Wehrmacht more than anything else the Americans brought to Europe. By the winter of 1944, many German soldiers had already learned to fear the sound that came before death, the rising howl of incoming American shells. But on the outskirts of Aachen, during one of the last major defensive stands in the West, that fear became something deeper. It became certainty. Certainty that survival was no longer a matter of skill or courage, but luck. Oberstfreiter Lucas Hartmann had been fighting since Poland. He'd survived the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, and the long retreat back through Europe. Yet nothing had aged him like American artillery. The Soviets fired in massive waves, chaotic and overwhelming. The Americans, he thought, were different. Their shells fell like they were guided by an invisible hand, precise, relentless, and always one step ahead. On a cold morning near Würselen, Hartmann's depleted unit received orders to hold the line for as long as possible, a phrase every German soldier now understood meant, until you're dead. They dug in along a half-collapsed farmhouse, shivering in coats that no longer kept out the wind. Rations were nearly gone. Ammunition was low. But the worst part wasn't hunger or exhaustion. It was the silence. Because silence meant the Americans were adjusting their guns. At exactly 9:12 a.m., the first shell came down. It landed 200 meters behind their position, throwing up a column of black earth. A ranging shot. Hartmann's breath froze in his throat. "Zuna!" One of the younger soldiers whispered. Too close. The second shell landed 100 meters in front of them. The Americans were bracketing, walking the explosions inward, pinning them like insects on a board. There was nowhere to run. No trenches deep enough, no cover strong enough. The farmhouse they hid behind had already been hit twice. Another direct strike would turn it into dust and splinters. When the barrage began in full, it felt like the sky itself was collapsing. Dozens of guns, 105s, 155s, even long-range pieces far beyond the horizon, fired in coordinated rhythm. The earth shook. The air vibrated. Hartmann could no longer tell if the sound was external or inside his skull. One soldier tried to crawl toward the tree line. He made it 10 meters before a shell exploded yards away, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. Another man panicked and tried to run back toward Aachen. He didn't make it 2 steps before Hartmann dragged him down. Standing up during a barrage was suicide. Minutes stretched. Shells landed around them with terrifying consistency. Every time Hartmann believed the fire had reached its peak, another, heavier salvo followed. It felt endless, like the Americans had unlimited ammunition and unlimited time. For the German soldiers pinned beneath that steel rain, the realization came quietly, almost peacefully. This was unwinnable. No bravery, no discipline, no heroic counterattack could stop an enemy who could drop thousands of shells wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. When the barrage finally ended, the survivors crawled out of shallow craters, deafened, shaking, and broken. Not a single American infantryman had appeared, yet the German line was shattered. Hartmann looked at the ruined landscape, the smoking earth, the splintered trees, the bodies of men who never even saw the enemy, and understood what many Germans would admit only after the war. The Americans didn't just destroy positions. They destroyed hope. There was truly no escape. By late 1944, American infantrymen had learned a simple truth. They were never alone. Somewhere far behind the front, hidden in forests, valleys, and muddy fields, the U.S. Army's artillery battalions waited like a silent promise. And when the call came, when a platoon was pinned down or an advance stalled, that promise arrived in the form of thunder. Private Carl Dawson first felt the weight of that advantage during the push through the Hurtgen forest. The place was a nightmare. Dense trees, fog, mines everywhere, and German machine guns hidden so well you could hear them but never see them. His company was caught on a narrow trail, pinned by fire coming from a fortified ridge. For 2 hours they tried to move. For 2 hours they failed. Their lieutenant finally crouched behind a fallen log and pulled out the radio. Dawson remembered the moment clearly. The officer didn't shout, didn't panic. He simply read coordinates in a calm voice, as if ordering lunch. And then they waited. The first American shells tore through the treetops a minute later. Branches exploded in every direction. The second salvo hit the German ridge directly, shaking the earth beneath the men's boots. What followed was a perfectly timed pattern. Adjust, fire, adjust, fire, until the entire tree ahead of them disappeared into a curtain of smoke and flying splinters. The Germans stopped shooting. The forest went quiet except for the echo of explosions rolling off the hills. Dawson looked at his friend and whispered, almost in disbelief, "We don't win this without the guns." Across Europe, the scene repeated itself again and again. In the French countryside, American artillery saved retreating units by slamming thousands of shells between them and advancing German armor. In the Ardennes, fire missions laid down in minutes created walls of steel that slowed entire panzer divisions. On the approach to the Rhine, the famous time-on-target strikes, where hundreds of guns fired so their shells landed simultaneously, ripped apart defensive lines before U.S. soldiers even moved forward. The Germans had good artillery, sometimes excellent, but they never had enough. They lacked ammunition, trucks, fuel, spare parts, and most importantly, the communication network to coordinate fire with the speed the Americans had perfected. The U.S. Army, by contrast, treated artillery not as support, but as the backbone of warfare. Every rifle company had immediate access to multiple batteries. Every battalion had radios tuned to fire direction centers. Every division carried tens of thousands of shells in reserve. It wasn't unusual for a U.S. general to order more shells in a single afternoon than Germany could produce in a week. That industrial advantage became a battlefield advantage. And that battlefield advantage became victory. On a ridge overlooking the shattered town of Remagen, Dawson witnessed the end of a German counterattack. American artillery had fired continuously for over an hour, so long that the ground itself seemed to pulse. When the smoke lifted, the German assault force had simply ceased to exist. Dawson realized that day what many Germans already knew. The Americans didn't just outfight them, they outgunned them, and the war ultimately would be decided by the side whose guns could fire the longest, the fastest, and the most accurately. The United States had built those guns, and that firepower helped win the war.